So, quick recap. I think it's fair to say that 2020 is a year that defined us all by challenging. Challenging to say it was a massive understatement. It was a year of no comparison, unless of course you happen to be over 90. There's no surprise, therefore, I guess, that the way we've embraced the return to aspects of our life this week, with so many people basically standing in line, including myself, for a haircut on Monday, and equally standing in the pub on Monday night, really getting back to enjoying the company of others. And regardless of the cold, it was really great to witness so many people smiling and enjoying the company of friends and family, grown adults behaving like children. And despite how everyone was feeling yesterday, including Molly, we were reminded that these small victories have been hard fought for. So it's also equally important, I guess, that we recognise that they could so easily disappear if we abuse these small freedoms. In the meantime, hybrid working styles have been adopted across the industry, with a graduated return to the office in flight. And in many cases, agencies have abandoned altogether the permanent place of residence, but have considered that actually there are ways in which they can continue to work collaboratively without the need for an office. We'll see how that unfolds. I think there's, the jury's out on that one. I think we all need to be able to press the flesh on occasion. Talking of pressing the flesh, the vaccine rollout has continued to now 32.250 million, 32.25 million people have now been jabbed. And of those, a second dose has been administered to nearly 8 million people. The number of positive tests continues to fall. It's 15% down on the 7-day average. Likewise, patient admissions and unfortunate deaths thereafter are also decreasing, which is good news. However, I guess complacency is the watchword here, and we need to continue to educate and commit to being vigilant and careful, else we will see, I'm afraid, another surge. In other news, many of you may have read the Campaign School Report. That's Campaign magazine, once the doyen of the advertising industry, perhaps not the powerful beast it once was, nonetheless still a periodical that we all end up reading for some reason. They published their school report this week, and what was really interesting, it shows the charts and the development, in particular of the smaller, mainly independent agencies, and how well they have done in the last few years, and in particular how they've been able to adapt more rapidly to the COVID experience, and many of them have actually enjoyed decent growth last year. I think it's fair to say that recession and periods like this really can be a good catalyst for the development of newer, nimbler businesses to fill market gaps left by the global groups. And we've seen that, we've seen that all the time with new agencies coming to market. Of the top 100 creative agencies, just over 1/4 grew and 3/4 shrank in billings in 2020. Couple of notable ones. One agency grew by 317%. Of course, that agency would have been the agency that was producing the content for the COVID campaigns. The top 50 media agencies, just over 1/3 grew and nearly 2/3 shrank. As I said earlier, many of the new wave of independent agencies have prospered very well in 2020. Uncommon Creative Studios, which was winner of Campaign's Agency of the Year in 2020, made it into the top 50 in its third full year of existence after its launch in 2017. New Commercial Arts, which is James Murphy's new agency, which was launched in May of last year, managed to get into the 62nd spot, the top 100, largely as a factor of their win from Halifax, which was in fact a client they brought from their old agency, Adam and Eve. And also making their debut in the top 100 was an agency called Wonderhood Studios, which was founded in 2018 and won the Starling Bank Accountant 3. So why is it so many of these independent agencies are growing at the expense of the networks? It's a question I ask myself almost daily basis. I was on a panel yesterday, and we were talking about the emergence and development of independence around the world, with people from North America, from Canada, and from mainland Europe. And it was all the same, and everyone was talking about the rise of independence. So it's exciting times for independent agencies, and we need to use the opportunities afforded to us by the self-introspection that the groups are going through at the moment. But I'd like to suggest that a lot of it is to do with structure and working practices and attitudes that just don't exist within the groups. And I suspect it also has something to do with the attitudes of the owners of the agencies and their ability to basically go that extra mile. So with this in mind, I invited Pete Martin to join us today to lend his thoughts on how to make and sell better ideas. For those that don't know Peter, he is a founder and strategic director and executive creative director at AlwaysBeContent, ABC. He has over 30 years experience as an executive creative director and agency leader. Pete is one of the UK's most experienced creative professionals. He's someone I've known for a number of years now. He began his advertising career as a copywriter before forming his own agency, Smarts, and after selling the business to a PLC, he became executive creative director at The Gate Worldwide, based in New York. And he's also a regular columnist, author for Scotland's national broadsheet, The Scotsman. He's also a pundit, and if you get the chance to watch some of his videos, which you can find on both YouTube, Insta, and I believe also obviously on LinkedIn, which is produced throughout the COVID pandemic, they're both insightful and amusing and occasionally worrying. He moved back to the UK and sensing clients' wishes for a different sort of agency dynamic, he launched AlwaysBeContent in 2017. As I say, he's an award-winning, passionate believer in the creative product and has a hard-won view on how agencies can develop better ideas more efficiently and sell them more effectively. So one of the things that I sort of voiced in the introduction and to the invite I sent out to you in the last few days is that we spent so much time focusing in the last 12 to 18 months on data, customer journeys, on looking at marketing automation, looking to the more scientific way we approach the art of communications, that there really has been little time or little passion, I guess, or energy behind actually thinking more about what the important bit is, which is actually what you're actually communicating and how you're doing it. So Peter's going to give some insights to that today. He's prepared a presentation, which we'll also share with you afterwards. I hope you enjoy it. He's a great speaker, and I'd like to welcome you. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for the foregoing bumming me up, as they say. I'll try and speak slowly. You can probably hear that I have a Scottish accent. If I start speaking too quickly, just put your hand up and I will slow down. So thank you, everybody, for coming along to the Pimento talk-in, especially when the last thing you probably need in your life is another Zoom or Teams talk, and especially down south where I believe the pubs might actually be even open right now. So if you can stay at the pub for another hour, that would be quite nice. I'll try and keep this short and snappy, and if you can get some time back at the end of this, that's so much the better. I'm going to talk about how to make and sell better ideas, and those two questions are very much linked in my mind. And can I ask a quick question? Who here is agency management versus who is a practical versus who's agency manager? Who's a practicing creative? So a couple of practicing creatives, and what the rest of us, are we just in agency life, or who's on the agency side? Any clients here? Okay, we can speak freely. We can speak freely amongst ourselves then. That's great. So for those who are practicing creatives, some of what I say might sound like teaching my granny to suck eggs. And for those on the account management side, what I'm trying to do is sort of give you an insight into what I believe the sort of black magic box of creativity sort of looks like when you're on the inside, and what really works. As Stephen told you, I've been in the business for quite a long time. My background is really, I've got a degree in English. I've got an MA in English, perhaps the most useless degree ever. I ended up knowing a lot about James Joyce, but not a lot about the real world. So I got a job in advertising. I actually started as an account man, and I was fairly terrible at it because I couldn't stop arguing with clients. But I became mates with an art director, and the two of us used to come up with ads together, and then I used to sell them to my clients, which must have infuriated the agency no end. Because they eventually made us a creative team, and Al and I worked together for about 8 years. I started my own agency, Smarts, which is still going strong, although the PLC that bought it has turned it into a PR network, much to my chagrin, to be honest. And then I appointed myself creative director. Our work was widely admired, but I would have to say that in terms of people management, I wasn't much cop at it. And it wasn't until I went to New York when you find that you're no longer the owner and the boss, and you're an outsider. That actually you have to work in a different way to get people on side and bring them with you. And that was very important for the basis that the agency at the point I went there was losing $2 million a year post 9/11. And my brief was to help turn around a sinking ship, which wasn't exactly fun. But the key to doing that was producing better creative work, because the work that when I got there, it was absolutely murder. So by the time I left that agency, it was the most profitable agency in the network, and that took a bit of work, to be honest. I stuck with that PLC world till 2016 when I could see that the world was changing, and some of the larger agencies weren't, and clients were as unhappy as the staff. So that's why we started AlwaysBeContent. The name was a bit of a joke, to be honest. But we get generally known as ABC. In that time, we've won a bunch of awards. They're nice to have, but I don't hold much sway by them personally, so I can explain that some other time. So I suppose how to make and sell better ideas. I'm going to share my screen now, but if you've got a question as we go along, you put your hand up. If I can, you've got a little digital hand or something. Hopefully I can see that, or put it in the chat. Lauren is on hand who works for us, and she's going to try and take a note of that. Or feel free to give a thumbs up or something else, other digital reaction, and that might just be a bit more fun as we go along. So let me just quickly share the screen. I don't use Teams, Zoom that often, so this might be a bit of a faff, to be honest. Does that work? Can people see that? Boom. Right. Let me just move some of the bits around. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about any fancy theories or how to win awards. There is a bit of a formula to winning awards, but it's different from the daily grind of making and selling better creative. I'm also not going to talk about any of the grand theories of like disruption or Saatchi's brutal simplicity, or even, God help us, storytelling. I'm going to talk about how to delight your clients and make the process easier with better, more predictable results. Over time, that helps you build a better body of work and get the best out of your talent base. A lot of the time you think it'd be great to get in some players from the Premiership, to get in some great creatives, but unless you're actually playing in the Premiership, that can be problematic for financial reasons. Plus, sometimes thoroughbreds just don't really fare well outside of the big clubs. Lastly, I was touching on a subject that's dear to Stephen's heart. These days he says, everyone's creative, and ideas can come from everywhere. So how do you develop a creative product and help build a long-term career within that kind of mindset? And hopefully we can have a chat about that when we get there, Stephen. The first thing I'd say about agency culture is really about transparency. In most agencies I've worked in, there are a lot of unspoken assumptions about how work gets done, what kind of work gets done, and why. Are you trying to do something great or straight, as Dave Droga puts it? And Dave's the head of Droga 5, one of the world's great agencies, a really smart guy. And he makes that distinction between great and straight, and there's not really a lot in between. And it applies at the agency level as well as at the individual product level. And if you're not clear about it, it can cause confusion and friction. I remember in the early days of my career going to the pub with one of the account men, and he confessed that he'd got out of the car on the way to a client meeting and threw some of our creative work over a hedge. So you can see it's the kind of thing that it can cause friction when there's a basic lack of a shared agenda. It's corrosive to trust and to teamwork, and that's poisonous to the business. I think within an agency, everyone's a grown-up, and I think we should all be treated accordingly. And that, both the project management teams, the account management, the agency management, and the creative teams themselves. The challenge with trying to do something great or straight, or these days people talk about brand and demand, is picking your opportunities. As an agency or as a practitioner. I remember when I was a young copywriter, I used to try and break my heart in briefs that said, sail now on, and you try to do something great when sail now on was actually the answer and would probably work better anyway. The sort of reverse of that is that great ideas are harder to sell. A few years back, my mate Gino ran an agency in Australia, and he blagged his way in to see about 6 or 7 of London's top agencies. He went to Adam and Eve, Mother, Wieden and Kennedy, and so on, to see how they worked. And what struck him about the very best agencies was not coming up with the ideas, but the ability to make their ideas stick, to get them through the mill of client approval. So what makes it harder inside an agency, obviously, is that not every great idea is a great idea. Not every mold needs to be broken, and some molds are in fact pretty good. So straight work is often the path of least resistance, especially in a world obsessed by hits and clicks and other external marketing detritus. However, the problem for agencies then is twofold if everything is straight. One is clients get bored, and two is proving your value. If everything is straight, then the client would be as well doing it themselves. So welcome to the world of insourcing. And that is a real challenge for creative agencies now. How do you prove your worth and differentiation in a market is very important. I wasn't going to talk much about the actual process of coming up with ideas. All you need to know is contained in the little book on the left, written by James Webb Young. He was the creative chief in the 1940s at the recently deceased J. Walter Thompson. Absolutely fantastic writer and brilliant guy. But that little book, you can read it in about 20 minutes, and it tells you everything you need to know about coming up with good ideas. Although, as James Webb Young admits, most people don't believe it or are too lazy to adopt his approach. Lauren's going to put a link to a PDF of the text of that in the chat, so you can have a look at that over a coffee later. If you'd like a more hands-on view, I do recommend Steve Harrison's book, How to Do Better Creative Work. That's available as a digital book, so that's a really useful tome to have a look at as well. The other caveat I'd add is this quote from movie director Nick Rogue, who directed David Bowie in the art house classic The Man Who Fell to Earth. Rogue says, there is the right way to do things, and then there's another way. So this is just my own practical view of how to go about producing better creative work, but I'm sure there are plenty of other gifted creative professionals who might do it differently. I would say that my view is based on having, stuffed it up in almost every conceivable way over quite a long career. And what I've tried to do is find the common ways that things have gone wrong, and by trying not to make fundamental mistakes, make something that over the long term protects the agency, produces better work, more effectively, and work that's more valuable to clients. So here goes a bunch of stuff that I'm sure we all know, but in the hurly-burly of agency life often gets forgotten. The first point seems blindingly obvious, but in the days when people, you get an email from the client with a brief, and then you're the account manager or the project manager, and what you do is you press forward and send it to the creative team. That happens all too often. So I think the first part of internal discipline is to get a brief. Make sure you actually get a brief, get it written, and get it on one page on one side. And there's a reason why I say that. There's two parts to the process. If the brief is too long, it takes out the clarity, and really clarity is what you're really heading for. But more critically than that, if it's on a second side of a piece of paper, you'll often find that a creative person doesn't look at it. Now, I do remember fabulously a guy called Paul Monahan had produced some creative work, and let's say it was all purple or something. Paul, the brief says it can't be purple. And it was on the instruction not to make it purple was on page 2, and he hadn't looked at it. So it sounds completely mental. But if somebody's doing some creative work and the piece of paper sitting in front of them on their desk, it really, really, really helps to have all the information on one side of a piece of paper. Does the brief make sense? Sometimes there's a real art to writing briefs. If you get a brief from somebody and it doesn't quite make sense, you have to rewrite it until it makes sense to you. In terms of what you're trying to achieve. Often there's times there's just not enough discussion around what's behind the brief. So if you're a creative, talking to the people who actually know most about the project, what's behind it, is not verboten. In fact, I would encourage it. But what you're looking for is clarity, not just more information. Sometimes, people would give me a 64-page document and expect me to come to the same conclusion that they do. And I would say, well, obviously the key point to this is on page 17. They went, no, the key point is on page 63. And I'm like, now we're all at odds and ends. So it's really important to get that information distilled, even if you have to append a background document. But get it onto one page, one side if you can, and that really helps. The other thing I would say that is actually probably the most difficult part, because briefs tend to be highly verbal. It's often difficult to get across tone. I used to say, if you were to say, well, can you name a a female singer that sings, and in a sort of high pitch, and you, well, that's Celine Dion, but actually it's Bjork. So well, actually the external description fits both. So you have to be really careful about what you mean by things. I mean, tone is often the way that things go completely wrong. When rationally it all adds up, but the tone is the thing that doesn't help. The other thing that I think this is a really this is just stolen from John Steele, who was the planning director at Goodby's in San Francisco. And it's a really practical tool, both for developing ideas, but actually for selling them back to clients. Because if you can nail this, then you can nail both the conceptual side of it and the sort of sales process. The first important point is to take on board is, and this is often the only part of the brief somebody gets is, well, what does the client want to say? And that takes you towards the transactional drudgery style creative that you get in a lot of agencies. And then the second part is, well, what does the customer want to hear? All beers are the same. The client wants to say that it's made with the finest hops and freshest water. The customers want to hear that they look good standing in a bar drinking it. And a lot of creative sort of falls along those two lines, driven either by what the client wants to say or by some stuff that comes out of focus groups. And you along that line, you get varying views of tedium, to be honest. But you have to then, if you put in the creative view and try and balance off those three things, then you can triangulate it like a Boy Scout and find the idea in the middle. And that's a really useful process, because in terms of selling creative work, because if it doesn't say what the client wants to say, they won't buy it. If it doesn't include what the customer wants to hear, it won't work in the marketplace. But equally, if it doesn't include something to cut through the clutter and the noise, it's not going to work either when you put it out in the real world. So if you can get a creative project that does all of those three things, and you've got an idea that ticks those boxes, it should be a better idea. It should actually help you with the ideation process, but equally it also helps you dramatically in explaining it back to clients why this is a good idea and why it will work. And there's not many people that will argue with you. This is really for creative people. How do you get an idea? The James Webb Young guide is brilliant for it, but it is a physical process. I used to work with an art director. When he got a brief, he would lean back and put his feet on the table, and he was incredibly slow. So the part of the process is actually starting physically as well as mentally. I mean, if you ever saw my own creative process, you would laugh. I usually start by writing over and over what it says in the brief, the sort of what's the key message and the line in the brief. Just write it over and over. When I get bored doing that, I switch between that and drawing pictures of it. And what you're really trying to do is to aim for quantity of ideas. I used to work with a creative who was obsessed by coming up with the world's greatest idea. He wouldn't come up with anything until he thought it was great, and he was completely paralyzed most of the time. So first and foremost, just looking for quantity. You're not really trying to put any great quality filter on that. And to produce a quantity of ideas, it's really helpful to have a couple of things. One is knowing a lot about the subject, and that comes from James Webb Young's book. Research the subject is the part that people try to skip because it's boring and it's hard work, but it's absolutely invaluable. It's hard to have an idea about something if you don't know a lot about it. But equally, it helps to know a lot about other stuff that often random inspiration. The kind of thing that helps you do that is having a lot of wide reading and a lot of wide inputs. These days, when creatives spend all of their time looking up Pinterest and looking at other stuff, it's quite limiting. The other thing is, I've had lots and lots of really stupid ideas in my time, and I'm never afraid to say them. And because sometimes you just never know that if you're working with in a creative team or whatever, it might just lead to something else. So don't be precious about the stuff you're doing. And then, as I said earlier, switch between verbal and visual, and that really helps you just keep your mind going. Random inputs. Most agents I've worked in have had a really good selection of creative resources, old DNA books and so on, and they're really quite useful in the process. Not for copying, to be honest, but just to break up your mental patterns. because otherwise what you call it, you get stuck in the river, and you're just heading in one direction. You can't get out of it. So random inputs are pretty good. I do remember once working on a brand for Indian food thing, and didn't know a lot about it. I got off the train in Edinburgh, walked into a really cool cafe that has a bookshop next to it, and the first thing they're proud on display was a guide to Bollywood, and I was thinking, wow, that's absolutely amazing. What a stroke of luck. Just at the time I'm looking for inspiration on Indian food, there's a thing in Bollywood. Of course, that book was always there. It would always have been there. And the fact that your mind's now looking for stuff, it sort of helps you out. So if you're in the creative process, it really helps to get out and about, to go different places, and you'll find your mind starts to look for stuff. The other thing is about what to do if you're stuck. We used to have a planner in one of our agencies whose advice was always terrible. She used to say things like, imagine you're and this is a genuine statement she once made. She says, imagine you're a fireman on the moon. And the whole creative was like, what the fuck? But I always think if you're stuck, it's like, well, make it small, make it big, make it green, make it black and white. Something that's absolutely external to the process, really can really help you out. Once you've got a bunch of ideas, usually one of them starts to leap out at you as being something that might be worthy of development. This is something I'm really guilty of. As soon as I think I've got half an idea, I think that's a great, job done. Because the sort of blank page and not having a solution is quite stressful. So you're tempted to sort of stop a bit quick. John Cleese has got a fabulous talk that you'll find on the internet about how to come up with creative ideas. And he always says that, he was not the most talented of the Pythons. The other guys were funnier, but he just had a better process and worked harder at it. They would come up with some funny stuff and then they'd be happy. He would come up with what he thought was quite good, but then he would just keep going. And he said over that perseverance helped him bring out better ideas than them in the long run, though he had less talent. So once you think you've got a sort of an idea, what you're then trying to do is you're then sort of going into edit mode to try and work out how good is this idea I've got. And I would say if you've got a morass of stuff on your desk as ideas, you're trying to lift that one idea and then cut and polish it. And if it's easy to refine, I usually say that's a good sign. And if it's hard and you're finding it struggle to make it work, it's probably a bad idea. And that's quite a good test, because sometimes you've got an idea and you sort of love it like a little baby, and you try and then develop and you think it's really quite difficult to do this, and you try to kid yourself on it's still a good idea. It's probably not. Then after you've sort of sorted it out and you've got it clear in your mind how it works, I would say you're then trying to then expand it out again. And I would say what I would call a rule of 3. If you've got an idea and it's a good idea, you just want to do 3 executions of it. No more than that. If you can do 1 execution, it's an idea. If you can do 2, it's a quintessence. If you can do 3, it's a campaign. You don't have to do 15. If you can do 3, you can do 15, but you'll need to do 3, I think, just to prove the idea, because that's efficient. And then the next part is really about efficiency as well. If you're not the creative director and you're in the creative team, you need to get approval from the creative director. And in the days when I was a creative director, people often say, well, do you like it? And that's never really the question a creative director is trying to answer. Do you think it's good? And that's still not really the question. It's, well, what do I mean by good? Does it answer the brief? Sometimes people would show you stuff and your instinct would go, there's something not right about this. And you say, look, go and show me the brief. And you'd find that the creative work you're being shown has got very little connection to the brief. And that's, I would say that's probably 90% of the problem when your instinct is that something's not right. The other parts of it are, is it original? Is it engaging? Is it persuasive? Some of that is a judgment, obviously. Is it original? Some experience, you say, well, that's just like something else. We used to have a phrase that we used, is it surprising but inevitable? Which is a bit like the John Steele thing. Does it say what it's meant to say, but do it in a surprising way? It's what David Ogilvy talked about, the gorilla and the jockstrap approach. You can always come up with something surprisingly inappropriate. But to come up with something that's surprisingly appropriate is really quite difficult. And then you're on to I would say the tricky parts of the conversation that I talked about transparency and honesty with each other. there's no point in somebody coming up with a fabulous high production value idea when the client's budget won't support it. So is this achievable? In between the idea you have and the execution, is that achievable? And then sort of a pragmatic view, will this work? And the final point is, will the client buy it? We had a bit of a conversation around this with Stephen. I've got the view that that is certainly the province of something that the creative department should be concerned about. Not because I think you're trying to sell safe stuff all of the time. In fact, I would say the time, if I had a penny for every time an account man had told me a client wouldn't buy an idea and they do, I'd have about £1 probably. But I would lean towards always trying to sell the client an adventurous idea. But if you're all convinced around the table and you're honest with each other that this idea is never, ever, ever going to fly, and you're as well accepting it and moving on and having a grown-up conversation about it, because otherwise it's a complete waste of everybody's time and money in a fee-driven environment. To set off to do something that you think the customer is definitely not going to buy, and run the risk of pissing them off because they think you're idiots, is not really a good way forward. Let's discuss. Once approved as an idea, I always think it's, I've never liked the process of, the old tension between, suits and creatives. I do think it's important that the account project team are brought along with the idea. There are times in my career when you've been able to bludgeon, ideas through the process, but I think it's a bad methodology. I think it's much better if everybody gets on board with it and the account team is enthused by the concept. And if you've done the work, you've got to be confident and be able to explain and sell that idea internally, because if you can't sell it internally, you're going to really struggle to sell it externally. But of course, you have to be ready to take on genuine objections and practicalities on board if you're having an open and honest discussion with each other. The classic, you've missed off the logo, and that's the wrong logo, all of that kind of stuff that I have definitely done in the past. And then there's the question of how to deal with rejection. I used to work with a guy, I won't tell you what his name is, but if any of his ads or creative ideas were ever rejected, he used to go completely mental. And you're like, it's the only idea, it's the best idea in the world. And of course, what it turned out was it was the only idea he had. He actually wasn't very good. And if you rejected his idea, he didn't have another one. So I think no thinking is a real problem. It sort of locks people off to the future possibilities. And an open mind is a more creative mind, obviously. The best talk I ever heard in my career was done by a guy called Bob Barry, who was an art director at Fallon McGillicuddy, and he did this talk called "The Client Killed My Ad, Thank God," and he showed all of these ads, and they were all brilliant. And all these creative campaigns are all brilliant. And then he showed you what he did once they'd been rejected. And all of the stuff he did second time around were much better. And he said, well, I've got an open mind, and I just think, well, I'll give it another go. And he said, you just sometimes arrive at a better place. The other thing I'd say about people who take their creative job very passionately is about perspective. I'm as passionate about good creative work as anybody, but and this is a line told by John Steele about when he was a junior planner and was working on the Club Biscuit account, and they'd gone along to the client, and the client was enthusing about how they'd put an extra micron of chocolate on a Club Biscuit, and housewives were going to break down the door. He said, the account director leaned forward and said, it's only a fucking chocolate biscuit. And I sort of feel the same way about creative work. It's very important. I'm very passionate about it. But if it gets rejected, well, ultimately, you got to move on and come up with something else, because you've got to go home and be happy in your life. This is a bit of an odd one, really, and I think it's become more of an issue, and particularly if you work in overseas markets, particularly the US, that is pretty good at suing people. You remember that poor old George Harrison, the biggest hit he ever had was My Sweet Lord, which was undiscovered plagiarism on the chiffons sheet. He's So Fine. He didn't know that when he wrote it, but he had the echo of that other song in his mind. And it's quite easy in the internet age for clients to find things that look remarkably like the things that you're trying to sell. So as a little bit of a process thing in the midst of your creative development, I think it's important just to pause and go, okay, have we got any issues here, particularly when young creative teams might be using stuff that's inspired by other stuff. It's well worth having a pause and looking at that. Presenting for clients. This is important really only on the basis of agency efficiency. It takes a lot of time and effort to make presentations and to sell creative work, but you never get paid unless the work sells, unless it goes through the process. So this is a part of the process where you're trying to make this as effective and efficient as possible, and that's about using the minimum and fastest visualizations to sell the idea. How to get the ideas across as quickly as you can in the time that you have. And that really means don't start visualizing images, logos, or writing copy until you've worked out the whole design and structure. Certainly worked with creatives in the past who have started, doing lavish visualizations of things that then don't fit into the structures they have. And then the classic thing is, the boring stuff at the bottom. If particularly in certain sectors like finance, where there is compliance and other bits and pieces that have to be taken care of, and even the client's brand, there's obviously a fashion for, in some creative circles, for light branding. But if you have to rehash everything you've got to take care of that stuff, then it's quite inefficient. And that probably means the sort of visualization process is important. You leave time for ideas and time for refinement and revision, time for crafting the final product. And sometimes product presentation does make a difference. If you've got an idea that really relies on style and pitch and impact, then you have to allow for a bit of production value in the presentation. But that does mean if you've got that type of idea, it's going to take you longer to put it together. So you need your ideas faster. That you just have to build into the process. The other thing, was certainly guilty of this when people said, how is the work coming along? I was, well, when is the meeting? So, I think you've got options of, what are scamps, roughs, and full visuals. Very few clients can buy things from scamps and roughs these days, which I think is a huge pity. Everybody knows that you can knock out fully functioning, creative work, and why they can't buy it off a scamp is a mystery to me, but they often can't. But it does mean that you have to be able to do the work to the meeting, for the meeting deadline, but to try not to work to it, because if you do, it's what you don't see always gets you. I mean, the times when I've done pitches and I've left things to the last minute, it's been power, I've had power cuts that have happened, 15 minutes, where we're still trying to put the thing together at the last minute. You name it, it will happen. And it's a total waste of time, resources, and money if you sort of fall at the last hurdle. And because fully thought through things that are rough are better than, lovely stuff that isn't finished. I mean, I once worked with a guy called Mike Mystery, and it wasn't his real name, but that's what he called himself. And I once had a presentation where, let's say the presentation had like 10 elements to it. He had finished 90% of it. He'd finished 90% of each of the 10 elements, but not a single thing was finished. And as I was trying to go out the door, I was tearing my hair out. So it's really important that people are practical about the way they go about building presentations. You can take 9 out of 10 things and 10 things not done, but you can't take things that are all in bits. So sort of sounds silly, but worth talking about. The other point that I think is quite important is really around the sort of the process within the agency. There was an occasion when we ran Smarts where my business partner who was the MD, came through and was going absolutely ballistic about, he'd had a client on the phone complaining about a piece of creative work, and I had to say, Rob, I've got no idea what you're talking about. And the creative team and the account handler between them had managed to avoid the agency process, and the account handler claimed that the creative team had given them the work, and they claimed that he had taken it. And then it was ructions all around. So just as a sort of important thing for everybody covering themselves, make sure that the work's first seen by the creative director and signed off, and then seen by the account handler team, as I said, and sort of approved. Very important. Producing the work, you got to be organised. This sounds silly, but it's one of the things that can catch you out. It's just this, if you start a production process without having all of your style reference and shortlist and your props and all the rest of it sorted out, it can go horribly wrong. It's really inefficient to turn up at a photographer's and not have a shortlist. You know, people have been known to do a whole shoot and then forget to take a shot, and the whole thing has to be, you know, set up again. Waste of time looking for props, you know, waste of time trying to describe on the day to the photographer the style you're after when that needs to be sorted out in advance. Interesting copy costs no more to write than bad copy, so I think that's an important thing. Attention to detail is obviously critical. You know, if you get something wrong in detail, you know, it can absolutely crucify you. The client won't care if it's not the world's best headline you've ever written, but if you get their web address wrong or the phone numbers wrong, it really does cause a lot of problems. This would be in the late 80s. I once put together some ads that had a free phone number in it, and the visual said 0800 000 and you would think that nobody in the right mind would put that through the process, but that actually went out in the press, and it turned out to be the helpline for the Prudential, which wasn't our client at the time. So I think, you know, the sort of the small things are incredibly important. The other thing is that I do say is in the sort of production process is about changing things without consultation. I've certainly seen this happen where an art director and a photographer have been working together, and the photographer's got an idea about doing things a slightly different way, and then goes and does it. And I think that can go horribly wrong. And I always say, well, if the photographer's got a great idea, that's fine, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it after we've done the thing that we've agreed to do that the client's expecting. That's absolutely important. And I say that not just for the sake of you know, common sense and agency, but actually for the person involved. You've got to if you're the creative person running the piece of business, you've got to cover your ass. Classics of the sort of how things go wrong in the sort of process between clients and agencies. I used to work with a girl who's now quite head up in the Royal Bank in NatWest, and Petra would say, you know, I'd say to Petra, you know, she'd come back with some creative work. I'd say, any changes she like? No, not really, just the copy, the pictures, and the layout. And she was just absolutely serious. She didn't think any of that was sort of mattered. And I said, like, no, this is these are actually really, really substantial. So I think that the key thing is, I say, is it's easy to get hacked off. But I always think when a client makes a comment on something, I think they're suggestions, not instructions. So the creative department, you've got to be creative and use your brains to deliver what the client wants, but better, and then try and persevere for quality. But what I would call, you know, disimprovements. Not every client's got great taste. Not every client's got great experience. So they come back with something that's fundamentally going to break it, and so you try and go back and accommodate what they're looking for, but give them better. And then say, no, but what I want is X. And you say, no, but okay, we'll go, what I think you're trying to say is this. And you go back. If that happens 3 times in a row, the game is over. Say, right, okay, now I'm getting rid of this as fast as I can. And because otherwise you run the risk, one, of breaking your own heart, but equally of pissing them off. And it's just not worth it. You just got to move on to bigger and better things. Production, I think this is, you know, attention to detail we talked about, but equally campaign consistency. That this is, you know, you can often find that people will start to reinvent the wheel. If there's a campaign style or a campaign consistency, why aren't you building from templates? Why aren't you building from stuff that's been, you know, do it once, do it brilliantly, and then repeat it, as opposed to somebody trying to do a half-assed version of it because they can't be bothered going and looking back at the last thing that was done properly. So that means looking at the type. Is the style right? Is the position right? Is the size right? Is the kerning right? Is the lettering right? Is the space right? Is the typos right? I used to have a test that I used to give to young creatives, and I used to ask them to find one of their favorite pieces of creative work, and then I used to ask them to replicate it. And you'd be amazed how people don't really look at the detail and the granularity of what makes something brilliant, because inevitably their version of the thing they were trying to copy was hopeless. And the thing that made the thing great in the first place was really about the detail, about the absolute the absolute fine way the thing had been crafted. So it's really a worthwhile exercise, I think, to get people to look at what really makes quality in a final output. Sometimes within an agency, you get small jobs and you say, well, we're going to send this straight to artwork, and that's really usually a recipe for disaster. That sort of phrase still has to be overseen by somebody with a bit of quality to their eye. And then the other thing I said about transparency and is people trying to take responsibility for what they're doing, and having some kind of sign-off responsibility. The old days of having a stamp that everybody signed are probably gone, but I think it's important that people who are in the process are consulted as it goes along, and take responsibility for what they're doing, and try and maintain a good spirit about it as well. I mean, one of the classic stuff ups that happened in my career, and it was again when I was working in one of our agencies down in Manchester, and the creative had been getting tortured on this piece of creative work, and eventually he got so pissed off, he sent the final thing to the account handler and said something like, "Here's this fucking piece of shit," in the email. The account handler never read the email and forwarded it directly to the client, and we lost the business that afternoon. So it's worthwhile. There's a worthwhile around about sign off and responsibility, and people taking due responsibility for the process and the work that's gone in, and trying to maintain some level of perspective on what's going on. I suppose the final point, you'd be glad to know we're coming to the end of this. This was a point of view shared by me with Stephen Knight. These days, everyone's a creative these days. Ideas can come from everywhere, and even the media department. And I think in some ways that's as it should be, since one of the well springs of producing ideas is knowing a lot about the client's business, and everybody who's involved in the business should know a lot about the client's business. And of course, low entry cost to creative technology and platforms like Instagram have shown that lots of people have a knack for communicating with photos and what we used to call clip art. But that's not the same, I think, as a sustainable, reliable, focused way to come up with ideas that delight clients. Of course, you can learn to be more creative. I have a friend who runs courses for non-creative people to do non-creative things more creatively, like account management. And you can get better at creative work. You can get better at creative work yourself, but it's probably like other pursuits, golf or tennis or football or music or ballet. To get really good, you probably have to start young and spend the obligatory 10,000 hours doing it. That's why Shakespeare is a better dramatist than an infinite number of monkeys with typewriters. And this is Malvolio from 10th Night performing and being very creative with his yellow garters. So I think if in more popular culture, that's why, though the centre back in football may score occasionally with a header from a corner, strikers are paid handsomely for having the knack to put the ball in the back of the net more reliably than other team members. But I do think it's harder to maintain a creative career these days. Much of the work has become transactional. And even though there's plenty of evidence that's long-term poison for both the client and the agency, Lauren's going to post a bunch of links to classic creative wisdom in the chat, which I think are worth sort of, I think Stephen sort of hit the nail on the head when he said, we're trying to breathe life back into the creative business, and all this transactional humdrum stuff. How do we stand out in the market? All of these books are brilliant and easy to read and inspirational. So I think the challenge for all of us and for Pimento as a network is grasping the opportunity to stand out by reclaiming the territory of making and selling better creative work. I think that's a long-term journey, but it's a daily process, and I hope you found this chat useful. So thank you for listening, and let's talk.
Pete, thank you very much indeed. It's some brilliant insights, really, and inspiring thoughts around the process and how to be more creative. I think the point I was trying to make about plus fours aside, about creativity in general, is that what we are seeing is the very concept of an agency and who produces creative ideas evolving, and that actually arguably what we've now got is a proliferation of different channels, all of which have the ability to be creative, but largely aren't. So, you know, people kind of play the channel rules and they use data and they segment it and they put their messages out. And, you know, there isn't much passion or process that goes around the creative process. And as a result of which, a lot of the messages are a bit humdrum. You know, it's very disposable. It comes in, it goes out. It doesn't really actually impact on you necessarily. Almost rely upon frequency rather than actually having a really brilliant idea that really will cut through. So I just thought, you know, really want to expand upon that and open it up to questions now, really, to anyone who's got a point of view on this, and to get your thoughts, because my argument is everyone needs to be creative in whatever channel they're working in. I'm not suggesting everyone is creative, but everyone, I think, has to recognize that there is the opportunity through better creativity to actually make more effective communications. And it's not just advertising, because I think we always sense and always talk about agencies in the sense of advertising agencies. And I think that's unfair and unfortunate, because I think all agencies, regardless of what they produce, and whether it's advice to clients or whether it's technical build or whether they're even producing code, they have the opportunity to be creative and create a better experience or a better piece of communications and so on. So lots of stuff to unpack there. Can we have some questions, please, from anyone? And we've got Pete in the seat. Now's an opportunity to grill him. Phil, you're never short of coming forward with ideas, and as a former accountman, I'm sure you've got similar experiences to the ones that Pete was suggesting earlier on. Just unmute you.
I can see Lisa putting her hand up.
Now, Phil, you're talking to yourself, mate. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I lost my screen for a moment. That's why I was struggling. But yeah, therein lies one of the problems of, you know, age, Pete, not being able to work the technology. My comment is this. Thank you, by the way. You know, I was at J. Walter Thompson for 23 years and Low Howard Spink. So I value what you've said greatly, and it reminded me of some good times. But how do you sell really good ideas to increasingly boring people?
Who are the boring people? You mean clients?
Yeah, well, I'm trying not to use that word, but anybody that has a budget and is prepared to try and buy work, you know, and who speaks in text, writes in text, and has no cultural breadth or depth. This is a lovely therapy session for me, by the way, as I get this out. But, you know, it's so difficult with brilliant people with creative minds to accept that the person at the other end of the discussion has no interest in them or what they're doing or what they brought that day. Yeah, and that's always been a tremendous challenge for us. So what are your thoughts on how to get around that intractable problem?
Maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned. I've never found clients boring. I've always found that clients, you know, there are certainly, you know, there are definitely certain challenges in it where there are clients who are younger and inexperienced, and that's a bit of a challenge. There are some people who are very process-driven these days and who believe in economy, you know, who believe in what I would call economism, that it's all about money and transactions and all the rest of it. But I think those always run out of steam very quickly. I mean, I used to have this saying that I kept on saying to people, and because I passionately believe it's true, but all direct marketing fails. It runs out of human connection quite quickly. I mean, the analogy I often give is that you know, stuff that's like brand, it's like a birthday gift. You know, it's got it's something that's for you. It's been thought about personally for you as the consumer. It comes in a nice shiny package and it's got nice production values. It's something you're going to value. And of course, as soon as you make a transaction and say, you know, here's a present, but give me a $5, you don't feel the same about it any longer. And so direct marketing always runs into that you know, where it burns up goodwill quite quickly. And there's a fabulous piece of work by God, the couple of econometric, it's Bennett and Field, isn't it? That shows that over 3 years how that transactional mindset just sort of sucks the goodness out of the relationship. So you do get a bit of that, but most senior clients I find understand that, and they're focused on what the challenge of different, their key challenge of differentiation in markets are becoming more and more samey, and how to try and make that work. I think Stephen's point around the opportunities to do differentiating work are becoming more and more difficult, I think, because the markets are not there. The entry point to media has become lower and lower. So the markets have got noisier and noisier. I mean, when we started Smarts in the mid 90s, we were one of the first agencies to do digital. We got very lucky in that we had a worldwide account for one of the first networking companies, a competitor to Cisco. So we had email in 1996, but you couldn't email anybody else and all the rest of it. And I always thought, when this digital stuff really lands, it's good. Marketing's going to be so much easier and so much cheaper. We're going to get a direct one-to-one relationship with the customer, and it'll be great. It's not been like that at all. Of course, the power of Google and Facebook has meant it's become more complicated, more expensive, and actually more distressing to communicate with clients. They've sucked the goodness out of lots of cultural things. They've destroyed the local press. They're in the process of destroying broadcast TV. So there are segments of the population that are now becoming incredibly hard to reach through conventional media, through paid media, and we do quite a lot of B2B. It's becoming even more nightmarish. Good prospects, good customers are consuming less and less in terms of media. As a customer, I'm probably incredibly difficult to reach as a customer. I've got ad blockers blinding me on my software. I don't really watch any terrestrial TV anymore. I don't listen to commercial radio. I don't read print newspapers anymore. So I'm probably incredibly difficult to get to. I think this is why I've got a belief in the resurgence of outdoor. The one thing that, once we're allowed back outdoors, we'll be like, hey, outdoors is the only way to get to people. I think most clients appreciate that. I think, and their problems are around in their heart of hearts. They know that they need to do it and how to differentiate, and then their challenge is selling it internally to the CEO. The things we say about clients, they say about the CFO and the CEO.
Yeah. I'm going to have to interrupt you both there because we're approaching the hour. Pete, thank you very, very, very much. There were a number of other questions which I will fire through to you answered, including personal branding. Really interesting question from Mark, which I'll put across to you and I'll connect you both. Very quickly, just a quick reminder, next week we've got 5 p.m. Club. It's back on Thursday. This time we're going to be hosted by Tangerine, who are a customer experience design and creative agency with over 30 years experience. Networking is back, first new event tomorrow in Windsor. And then next week, we welcome back Oliver Wright from Savanta and Annabelle Dunstan for Question and Retain. We're going to be presenting their quarterly updates on consumer and business sentiment survey, an update on the work that Annabelle has been doing on the tracking of independent agencies. It should be really interesting insight. Oliver's rolling survey, as you know, has been going throughout the pandemic, and he will get a real up-to-date view on how the US, UK, and other markets are feeling and coping with the pandemic. And if you're a reminder, the tracker covers 5 key areas: concern and impact, home and work, out of home and retail, news sources, and political approval ratings. And Annabelle obviously will be sharing the Alliance People's Pulse, which has been comparing trends in agency life to the end of 2020 and Q1 21. Again, really illuminating. I know you love coming to those particular events because it makes you look smart when you talk to your family, friends, and of course your clients. So one not to miss. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you once again to Pete. Really enjoyed it.
Everybody.